Hi Hammers fans, quick reminder, drop a like, hit subscribe, and leave your comment below. That way you'll always be the first to catch every update about West Ham United. In recent weeks, the atmosphere around West Ham United has become increasingly tense. Organized supporters such as the Hammers United group have begun planning new protests against the current board, mainly targeting majority shareholder David, Sullivan Czech investor Daniel Kretinsky, and Baroness Karen Brady. The dissatisfaction is nothing new in East London, but it has regained strength as many see the club's progress as stagnant. The situation gained further attention when respected sports journalist Martin Samuel, a longtime West Ham fan and a highly regarded voice in the British sports scene, decided to speak out forcefully. For him, much of the current outrage from fans borders on exaggeration and even conveys a sense of arrogance or excessive entitlement. Samuel not only criticized the tone of the demonstrations, but also drew an unusual parallel. He compared the Hammers' reality with that of Sheffield Wednesday supporters, a historic club enduring decades of hardship while striving to return to the top tier of English football. This comparison immediately makes an impact. After all, throughout much of the 20th century, matches between West Ham and Sheffield Wednesday were relatively common, and the Owls, the traditional nickname of the Yorkshire club, hold a clear advantage in the historical record. They have more than 40 victories compared to just under 30 for the Londoners across nearly 100 matches since the 1920s. However, what really stands out is the fact that since the year 2000, the two sides have not met in a Premier League match. That clash won by Sheffield Wednesday at Hillsborough marked the start of a long hiatus that continues to this day. Since then, only 2 domestic cup meetings have taken place, underlining how differently the two clubs' paths have unfolded in recent decades. While West Ham have consolidated continuous Premier League presence over the past 16 years, Sheffield Wednesday have been mired in sporting and financial crises, bouncing between the Championship League One and constant administrative turmoil. For many Owls fans, the idea of regularly competing in the Premier League feels like a distant dream. It was precisely this contrast that Samuel wanted to highlight when he labeled the Hammers' protests as entitled. In his view, to complain so aggressively about the current board after one of the most successful periods in the club's recent history seems disconnected from reality, especially when compared with the prolonged suffering of other fan bases. It is worth remembering that the relationship between West Ham fans and the current board has never been simple. The most striking episode of this tension occurred in March 2018 in a match against Burnley at the London Stadium. That day, the anger spilled onto the pitch. Some fans invaded. In protest, Paul Colborne planted the corner flag in the center circle as a symbolic act of defiance, and then Captain Mark Noble even brought down an intruder with a rugby-style tackle. Since then, even with significant achievements such as the UEFA Europa Conference League victory in 2023, the atmosphere of mistrust has never been fully dispelled. On the other hand, there is no denying that West Ham, under the leadership of David Sullivan and his partners, have enjoyed one of the most stable periods in their long history. There have been heavy investments in signings, a record run of consecutive seasons in the Premier League, and above all, a continental trophy that ended a wait of more than 4 decades. Samuel stresses that weighing up the past 20 years, it is difficult to describe the club's trajectory as sustained failure. To him, the protests at this moment seem more like a reflection of dissatisfaction with the stadium and the lost identity after leaving Upton Park, rather than an accurate picture of the club's sporting performance or financial health. This clash of narratives between a fan base demanding change and a journalist urging more calm and perspective is what fuels the controversy. And what stands out most is how the mere mention of Sheffield Wednesday exposes the contrast between two realities on one side, a club that, despite criticism, is experiencing one of the best moments of its modern era on the other, an institution fighting for survival amid endless crises. The debate around West Ham's protests cannot be understood without looking back at the collective memory of the supporters and the wounds left in their relationship with the board. The move from the old Upton Park to the modern London Stadium is without doubt the central point of this tension. For an entire generation of fans leaving the Boleyn Ground was not just a change of address, but the loss of an identity symbol that carried stories, traditions, and the unique atmosphere of a neighborhood stadium. For decades, Upton Park was seen as West Ham's home, the stage of great victories as well as painful defeats, but above all a place where every stand seemed to embrace the fan. When the club announced the move to Stratford, promising financial growth, more affordable tickets, and a chance to compete on equal terms with the Premier League giants, many believed it was an inevitable step towards the future. However, almost 10 years on, the prevailing feeling is that the club has drifted away from its roots without fully delivering on the promises made. This sense of uprooting is the fuel for the demonstrations. It is not only about results on the pitch, but something deeper, the perception that West Ham has lost part of its soul. And it is precisely this aspect that journalists like Martin Samuel try to put into perspective. For him, although nostalgia for Upton Park is legitimate, it cannot overshadow the fact that the club, in its new reality, has achieved unprecedented successes in the modern era. The contrast between memory and present, tradition and modernity is what feeds the division. The current protests also do not emerge in a vacuum. English football is marked by a long tradition of fan activism, and recent examples show how such pressure can, in some cases, bring about change. In Manchester, for example, groups of United supporters have maintained a critical stance for years against the Glazer family responsible for the club's highly leveraged financial management. In Liverpool, there were protests against abusive ticket price increases, forcing the board to reconsider its plans. In North London, Arsenal fans even mobilized against Stan Kroenke, accusing the owner of a lack of sporting ambition. The most emblematic case, however, may be Newcastle United. For a long time, supporters revolted against Mike Ashley, the owner accused of running the club as a passionless business, unwilling to invest to make it competitive. The pressure created a toxic environment that only ended when the club was bought by a consortium linked to Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund, a process that took nearly 3 years to complete. Today, the Magpies are living a new era, but the lesson is clear: ownership changes do not happen overnight. It is precisely this type of reflection that Samuel seeks to bring to West Ham fans. In his analysis, he acknowledges that the board can and should be criticized for planning mistakes, questionable signings, and communication often seen as detached from the reality of the terraces. However, he argues that the overall results do not justify the narrative of imminent collapse suggested by some protests. After all, West Ham have put together a run of 14 consecutive seasons in the top flight, won a European title in 2023, and invested more than £300 million in signings between 2021 and 2025. Meanwhile, the comparison with Sheffield Wednesday works as a mirror. The Owls, once English champions and a regular presence in the top division until the 1990s, now suffer successive administrative crises. Under the command of Thai businessman Dejphon Chansiri, the club struggles to balance its finances, faces intense protests from its supporters, and has even seen demonstrations take place outside the Thai embassy in London in a desperate appeal for change. For West Ham fans who still enjoy European nights and victories over Premier League giants, Samuel's message is clear: be careful not to lose perspective. Another point raised by the journalist is the volatile behavior of the supporters regarding the stadium. On great nights such as the victory over Sevilla in the Europa League or the triumphs against Chelsea and Manchester United, the London Stadium turns into a cauldron, silencing any structural criticism. However, just a short run of defeats is enough for the same ground to be described as cold, impersonal, and soulless. Samuel suggests that perhaps part of the hostility lies not only with the board, but also with the collective difficulty of accepting the club's new identity. This reflection, though uncomfortable, touches on a sensitive wound. To what extent do the protests represent a legitimate struggle for change? And to what extent do they express a difficulty in adapting to the inevitable transformations of modern football? When looking at West Ham's recent trajectory, it is impossible to ignore that the club is experiencing one of the most solid periods in its history. The team has been in the top division for more than a decade and a half, has consistently competed in European tournaments, and most importantly lifted a continental trophy in 2023. That triumph, the UEFA Europa Conference League, not only ended a wait of more than 40 years without a major title, but also reignited the pride of the supporters on an international level. Few clubs outside the so-called Big Six can boast of winning a European trophy in this period. Even so, dissatisfaction persists. Part of it stems from the perception that the investments made have not always translated into consistent results. The club has spent more than £300 million on reinforcements over the past 4 years, but several of those players have failed to deliver, whether due to injuries, lack of adaptation, or questionable decisions from the football department. This inconsistency fuels critics who claim that West Ham could be in an even stronger position had there been more efficient sporting planning. It is at this point that the protests gain strength for a significant portion of the fans. The current board has failed to capitalize on peak moments to transform the club into a regular presence at the top of the table. The fear is that without structural changes, recent achievements will become isolated episodes rather than the start of a sustained era of competitiveness. However, Martin Samuel argues that this reasoning overlooks the wider context of the Premier League. The competition is by far the most financially balanced at the top, with mid-table clubs investing sums comparable to European giants. For him, the very fact that West Ham have managed to remain competitive, defeat heavyweight opponents in key clashes, and carve out space in continental tournaments is already proof of effective, albeit imperfect, management. In his view, protests that paint a picture of collapse only hide under pressure and can ironically harm sporting performance. The journalist also highlights the atmosphere at the London Stadium. In his opinion, when the team is doing well, the ground becomes a fortress. But when the team hits poor form, the environment quickly turns into a hub of hostility, creating a vicious cycle. The danger is that negative energy becomes fuel for instability. Something already seen in previous seasons when a toxic mood in the stands was mirrored by poor performances on the pitch. The parallel with Sheffield Wednesday helps to illustrate the consequences of a prolonged rupture between fans and board. The Owls, once among the most respected clubs in England, now endure constant administrative crises, severe financial struggles, and an ever-widening gulf between supporters and owners. The result is a negative spiral where protests, however legitimate, seem incapable of producing real change. Samuel questions whether West Ham fans truly want to follow a similar path, fueling a climate of permanent crisis at a time that could instead be one of consolidation. Another point for reflection is the reality of ownership transactions in modern football. The sale of Newcastle United serves as an example. It took nearly 3 years of negotiations, rejections, reassessments, and political debates before the new group of investors finally arrived. For a club the size of West Ham, ranked among the 17 richest in the world in terms of revenue, finding a buyer willing to pay the fair price would not be a simple task. The expectation that protests might speed up this process could ultimately prove to be illusory. Furthermore, there's the issue of sporting risk. Should the stadium atmosphere become untenable and the team begin to suffer poor results, the possibility of relegation, however unlikely, always exists. In that scenario, the club's market value would plummet, making any sale even more difficult. The comparison proposed by Samuel is harsh but pragmatic. Just look at Sheffield Wednesday, who amid successive crises have seen their chances of returning to the Premier League grow ever more distant. Finally, there is an identity issue. Over 130 years, West Ham have built the image of a working-class club, resilient, capable of facing giants even in adverse conditions. The current dispute between fans and board seems to put precisely that identity at stake. While some argue that protesting is a way of honoring the club's tradition of struggle, others believe that maintaining stability and recognizing recent achievements is the real path to preserving the greatness of the Hammers. As the season progresses, West Ham find themselves at a crossroads that goes beyond the pitch. The team seeks to consolidate a more modern style of play, attempting to renew its on-field identity, while off the pitch the noise grows among a fan base, divided between the hope of a new era and the frustration accumulated over the years. The question that hangs is simple, yet powerful. To what extent do the protests help build a better future, and when do they become an obstacle for the club itself? The protests scheduled for the matches against Tottenham and Brentford symbolize this dilemma. For organized groups taking to the streets and filling the stadium with banners, chants, and strong messages against the board is the only way to push for structural change. For critics like Martin Samuel, this stance is an unnecessary risk capable of turning small problems into irreversible crises. In his view, West Ham are not in collapse, but rather in a transition process that demands patience and long-term vision. The dilemma is not unique to the Hammers. Other clubs have lived through similar scenarios. In Newcastle, the protests were intense, but the solution only arrived years later with the arrival of new investors. At Manchester United, even after 2 decades of criticism towards the Glazer family, the owners remain in charge, albeit weakened. These examples show that popular pressure has an impact, but rarely results in immediate change. At the same time, ignoring the supporters' voice is also risky. The history of English football is full of moments when fans were the last bastion of resistance against harmful decisions. It was so in the fight against the closure of traditional clubs, in the mobilization against the European Super League project, and in various battles for fair ticket prices. In West Ham's case, it is undeniable that much of the passion driving the protests comes from the desire to see the club respected and competitive, honoring its community roots. However, this is precisely the point Samuel raises. Is it possible that the way this outrage is expressed is paradoxically putting at risk the very future the supporters wish to protect? If the London Stadium becomes synonymous with constant hostility, the atmosphere could suffocate young players, deter signings, and turn each match into an emotional minefield. For a squad under construction, amid tactical and technical changes, this added burden could be devastating. The case of Sheffield Wednesday, used as a mirror, serves as a warning of how prolonged resentment can erode a club's foundations. The Owls, once champions and respected nationwide, now face the harsh reality of surviving amid debt and broken promises. The memory of fierce clashes with West Ham in the 1990s contrasts cruelly with the present, where there's not even the prospect of a reunion at Premier League level. For Samuel, imagining Wednesday fans watching the Hammers' complaints is almost ironic. While some dream only of returning to the top flight, others treat a stable and competitive spell as though it were the end of the world. West Ham's future will depend to a great extent on their ability to balance these two poles, the legitimate demand for more transparent and ambitious management, and the awareness that the club has already traveled a remarkable path of growth. The question that remains is whether the energy of the stands will be channeled to support the team on the pitch, or whether it will become fuel for instability with unforeseen consequences. Ultimately, the situation exposes a deep dilemma about the role of the modern supporter. To be demanding is part of the essence of following football with passion, but living permanently on the knife's edge between hope and revolt can become an unbearable burden. West Ham, with their tradition of fight courage and community identity, may be facing one of the greatest tests of their recent history, finding the balance between dreaming big and keeping their feet on the ground. The definitive answer does not yet exist. It will be written in the coming months on and off the pitch, in the stands of the London Stadium, in boardroom meetings, and in the pages of newspapers. What is at stake is not just the performance of a single season, but the direction a centenary club will choose for the coming years. And as Samuel points out, perhaps it is time to look at what is happening in Sheffield to understand that, however bad things may seem, there can always be a much darker scenario.